Hello again, Year 11. Been a while since the last Middle East video, but as promised, got there eventually. This one is going to be talking about the impact of the Second World War on Palestine. So picking up where I left off the last video. The last video, if you remember, was talking about the Peel Commission, the impact of the Peel Commission, and we saw that the Peel Commission had largely been accepted by the Jews. It was largely accepted by the Jews, but it had been completely rejected by the Arabs, and that had actually sparked the Arab Revolt of 1937 to 39. And we saw that by the end of the Arab Revolt, the Arabs in Palestine had been severely weakened by what had happened in the Arab Revolt, by the way the British had dealt with it. Many Arabs have been killed, their weapons have been confiscated, and most significantly, their leaders had been exiled. So they were essentially, by 1939, they were leaderless. Now, as I say, that was by 1939, and as you all know, 1939 is a very momentous year because that is the year that the Second World War begins. Hence why, this video is about the impact of the Second World War. So the Second World War, the Second World War, as you can see there, led to a significant change in British policy in Palestine because, next card, quite a few cards today, the British, there you go, were well aware that they needed oil from the Middle East if they were to win the war. So they know if they're going to win a war against Germany and obviously Japan in the end as well, if they're going to win that war, they need oil from the Middle East. They're not going to be able to get that oil from the Middle East if the Arabs and the Arab states in the region, aren't on their side. So they very much softened their approach towards the Arabs in Palestine because they wanted to keep them on side. And as it says there, because of this, the Peel Commission was scrapped because obviously it had been angrily, rejected by the Arabs in Palestine. And on top of that, as a kind of result of that, the number of Jewish immigrants was limited because, again, the British know that the more Jewish immigrants they let into Palestine, the angrier the Arabs are going to get. So they're trying to keep the Arabs very much on side by this point. Now, from a Jewish perspective, that was obviously terrible news because coincidentally, as you know, many Jews were trying to escape persecution of the Nazis in Europe and Germany and the other occupied territories. So when the British limit the number of Jewish immigrants allowed into Palestine, it's really, really bad news for those many Jewish people who were trying to flee. There was also a bit of a split in the Jewish population in Palestine, in that some supported Britain because obviously Britain were against the Nazis, who you can't get more anti-Semitic than the Nazis. So some Jews supported Britain. They were like, "Good, Britain are fighting against our enemy or an enemy of our people." In fact, to that point, 27,000, as you can see there, 27,000 Haganah and Irgun fighters fought alongside the British forces during the war. But, as I've put underneath there, some Irgun members disagreed and set up the extremist group called the Lehigh, and they continued to attack the British in Palestine in order to achieve a Jewish state. So, for some members of the Irgun who set up this group, the Lehigh, they go, well, no, look, it's all well and good the British fighting the Nazis in Europe, but our priority is getting this Jewish state, this Zionist state in Palestine. That's priority, and therefore we are going to continue to attack the British. So there was a bit of a divide there in the attitudes of the Jewish population of Palestine. Now, as you know from what we've looked at in the Germany course, in the Germany topic, part of the course, one feature of the Second World War was the Holocaust. And obviously the Holocaust had started really before the Second World War, but the Holocaust was a feature of it. And obviously towards the end of the war, the liberation of the Nazi concentration and death camps in, as I say, Germany and the occupied territories. And the Holocaust had, missed out my card. The Holocaust had a very big impact on what happened in Palestine straight after the war. And that is because, there you go, many victims of the Holocaust who had survived had lost everything by the end. They'd lost their families, their homes, their possessions, their jobs, obviously, and they had no reason to stay in Europe as a result. Many of them wanted a new beginning. They were like, there's nothing left for me in Europe. My life has been decimated, destroyed. I want a new start. Some went to America, but many of them thought Palestine is the place where I want to go and have a new beginning. As I put underneath there was a great deal of international sympathy for the Jews, understandably, of course, as a result of the Holocaust. So a lot of people around the world, really started to show some sympathy to the Jewish population, particularly of Europe and Holocaust victims, and kind of got on side with the Zionist mantra. So as I say, as a result of this, the calls by the Zionists became louder and louder, and therefore the questions about what should happen in Palestine needed addressing quickly. At this point, the British still had the mandate for Palestine. So Britain was still, in control of Palestine, and they were in charge of what happened there. So it was still their issue to deal with. Now, one of the big issues going on in Europe was there were 250,000 Jews, again victims of the Holocaust, in displaced persons camps in Europe. Many of whom, as I've said already, wanted to move and settle in Palestine. And the issue for Britain was dealing with this problem, but not upsetting the Arabs, which, is a delicate balancing act. There was, as I put here, a new government, a Labour government in Britain by the summer of 1945, and the new Foreign Secretary, a guy called Ernest Bevin, set a strict limit of 1,500 Jewish immigrants a month into Palestine because he wanted to, as I put down here, he wanted to, avoid a civil war between Arabs and Jews, because obviously he thought if we let loads of Jewish people in, it's just going to cause huge tension with the Arab population and maybe lead to some kind of civil war. And B, still, as I said before, wanted to maintain good relations with the other Arab states in the Middle East to maintain Britain's supply of oil. They've managed to do it during the war to keep the Arabs on side, and therefore they want to, keep doing that because oil is crucial. Now, following this, following the immediate aftermath of the war and the Holocaust, and what the British had done there by limiting the number of Jews who were allowed to settle in Palestine after the war, this led to what is known as the Jewish insurgency in Palestine between 1945 and 1947. So what was going on here, in a nutshell, was the different Jewish groups that I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, adopted several tactics to try and achieve the Jewish state that they wanted. Such as, well, there are two groups that you know about. I need to know about. So the first is obviously the Irgun and the Lehigh. They continued a campaign of violence against the British. Obviously some Irgun fighters had joined in with the British in the Second World War, but now the Irgun and the Lehigh waged a campaign of violence against the British to put pressure on the British to give them the Zionist state. The Haganah, on the other hand, were a bit more moderate. They tried to help as many Holocaust survivors as possible to reach Palestine, and I'll talk about both of these methods now. So, starting with the top one there about what the Irgun and the Lehigh were doing, there is actually a big list in the textbook on, I've written it down here, page 12 of the textbook, of what they did in terms of like the acts of violence that they carried out. But the biggest and most significant act that they carried out was on, there you go, the 22nd of July 1946 with the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. Now, the King David Hotel was the headquarters of both the Mandate administration, so essentially the government really in Palestine, and the British Army in Palestine. So what happened was Irgun members who disguised themselves as Arabs drove a lorry into the tradesman's entrance of the hotel and placed milk churns containing explosives by the main columns in the southern wing of the building. And when the bombs blew, 91 people were killed. So it was a huge loss of life and a major attack against mainly the British, although some Jews did die in this attack. So the effects of this bombing were twofold, really. First of all, in the short term, Palestinian Jews were actually put under harsher conditions as a result. So harsh restrictions, they had random searches, curfews, roadblocks, Many Jews were arrested, so they were kind of cracked down upon in the short term. But in the long term, the bombing of the King David Hotel, combined with all the other acts of terrorism and violence that the Irgun had carried out, started to wear down the British. Obviously, stationing troops in Palestine for Britain was expensive, anyway. And obviously, at this time, as you know, Britain was really struggling with its post-war recovery. It had, very little money, and keeping these troops stationed in Palestine was a very, very expensive job. So that alone was an issue. But on top of that, here are British soldiers and British diplomats dying in Palestine, and the British public couldn't really kind of comprehend that. They were like, hang on, the Second World War's over. The Second World War ended in 1945, and here we are in 1946, and British soldiers are still dying overseas. When's it going to end, kind of thing? Of course, it was a different situation, but, for many people in Britain, they were like, can British soldiers stop dying, please? It's been terrible. Second World War's been over for, a year by this point, or almost a year, so, this needs to stop. So it really wears down on particularly British public opinion. They start putting kind of pressure on the government to just get out of Palestine. As well as the bombing of the King David Hotel by the Irgun, the Haganah adopt, as I said before, more moderate tactics, not violent tactics, a bit more moderate, but still quite controversial. They continue to go against the British restrictions by trying to sneak in kind of would-be immigrants into Palestine. So they do this by getting ships, filling them with Jews who wanted to move to Palestine, and then trying to break through the British blockade that Britain had set up in Palestine, or by the sea, or in the sea, sorry, by Palestine. And they tried to get these ships through. Now, even though they were rarely successful in breaking through, most of the time the British Navy just stopped the ships and sent them back. It did get a lot of publicity, especially when these would-be immigrants, many of them were Holocaust survivors, and the British, what they would do with the ships that were turned around was they put them in camps in Cyprus. Not concentration camps, but, they were refugee camps, but still, here are these Holocaust survivors who have survived, the concentration and death camps in Europe, and now they're being put in camps again by the British. Yes, they're different camps, but still, it doesn't look good. People see Jews or Holocaust survivors being put in camps, and it doesn't look good for the British. And therefore, there's even more kind of sympathy for the Zionist cause from around the world. The most famous event of this kind was the one involving the SS Exodus in July 1947, where 4,500 Jews were on board. Most of them were Holocaust survivors, and when the ship was stopped by the British, the ship was sent back to France, where it had sailed from. The passengers actually refused to leave, and they went on hunger strike. And the British then moved the ship to Germany and put the passengers in refugee camps. And again, here were Holocaust survivors being put in camps in Germany. Again, it just didn't look good for the British. It was a huge, publicity for the Zionist cause, and it really kind of turned public opinion against the British again. So episodes like that with the Exodus had gained the Zionists a lot of sympathy, and there was a great deal of support from the Zionists, particularly from America, which had a very large population, a Jewish population, I should say. Around 5 million people in America were Jewish in 1945, so clearly big Jewish population in America, and therefore America is supportive of the Zionist cause. And in fact, in 1945 alone, Americans gave over $46 million to the Zionist cause. People were donating money to help the Zionists in Palestine, or those wanting to get to Palestine with all this money. So clearly there was a lot of support from America. And on top of that down here, Harry Truman, who was obviously the US president, he was a vocal supporter of the cause. 150,000 refugees were actually admitted to the USA after the Second World War from, again, mostly victims of the Holocaust. And he pressured the British to allow 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. Now, Ernest Bevin, remember the Foreign Secretary, I should say, he refused this at first because, as we've seen before, he said, look, it's going to end in some kind of civil war and it's going to upset the Arabs. but Truman actually used economic pressure to force Bevin's hand, or the British hand, because they were heavily reliant, again, as you know, on US economic aid to help them recover from the war. The British economy is really struggling at the end of the war. We're reliant on American money, and therefore if the Americans, basically threaten to stop giving us money, like Marshall Aid, then, that puts pressure on the British to go, well, all right, we'll let, Jewish people into Palestine. All of those reasons that I've just been through combined, so, the terrorism of the Irgun, the negative publicity of, things like the Exodus and the British dealing with the refugees in the way they did, sympathy for the Zionists from America, pressure from the USA, all led to, in February 1947, so actually just before the Exodus, but the Exodus kind of made this a bigger problem. In February 1947, the British actually asked the United Nations to come up with a solution. They were like, look, we can't solve this Palestinian issue, for all those reasons that I've just been through, the terrorism and the cost and the negative publicity. They asked the fairly newly formed United Nations, that had only been formed at the end of the Second World War, they asked the United Nations to come up with a solution. And that solution, well, kind of, inverted commas, because to some it's not a solution, to many it's not a solution, but that solution, of course, was the UN partition plan, which I'll cover in a future video, because I think I've talked enough there already about the impact of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So that's the next stage of, as I say, the Middle East course that I've been through there, with the impact of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and leading up to the UN partition plan. So I say I'll cover that in a future video. As always, if there are any requests for videos on the Middle East topic, or Germany, or First World War, or civil rights, just leave a comment below and I'll see what I can do about that. But as always, hope that's been of some use, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you very much.